sad times on the Odd Socks allotment. So, like many videos that are all over YouTube at the moment here in the UK, we've actually succumbed to blight. Now, it's not surprising. It's been incredibly wet through the whole of July and even into the first, week to 2 weeks of August. It is non-stop rain. Now, we're lucky today we've had a day or two of no rain, but on inspection of our tomato plants yesterday, we noticed a worrying sign. It looks like we've got early blight. Now, there is different types of blight. There's an early blight and then there's a late blight. The late blight is really, really quick to kill all your plants, where you'll notice a little bit of brown markings and then your plants will literally rot. Late blight is really quick acting. You'll notice a droopy, wet looking leaf, and then before you know it, you'll come back and your whole plant will be either on the ground or rotted away. Where with early blight, it's a little bit more subtle, but still can be just as deadly. Early blight, you may notice on the leaves first that you'll get little brown spots with yellow rings around them. Or you may notice some black spots or black patches on your tomato stems. Again, this is a sign of blight. And in our case, it's a sign of early blight. Now, to be honest, to be able to have got to the stage that we have got with our outdoor tomatoes, we were quite lucky this year. And as you know from previous videos, they haven't been the strongest, healthiest tomato plants outdoors this year. Our indoor tomatoes have done great, no issues at all. And our outdoor tomatoes in general, most varieties have been absolutely full of trusses of tomatoes. There is a few that have seriously failed to thrive, where in fact we've probably got one tomato off each one. Now, we have grown, I think outdoors, I think there's about 20 odd varieties, and there'll be some that we will try to grow again, but there'll be definitely some that we will not touch again for outdoor growing at least. So what can you do for blight? Well, not much. Now, you can keep an airflow going through with your tomatoes, keeping them well trimmed, but make sure you do not remove all the leaves. Your plants need these leaves to photosynthesize. Without them, you're not going to have a healthy plant. At the same time, you can't really avoid it. There is no chemicals and no treatments once you've got blight. There is a lot of old wives' tales, but in general, there is nothing that is available to the members of the public to actually stop blight. So the only thing that you can do is harvest what tomatoes are harvestable, going through carefully. Now, if they are green, you can ripen them in a nice warm area, even on your windowsill. They will ripen up. But there's also some fantastic recipes as well to actually use green tomatoes. And then you need to dispose of those infected plants. Now, there's pros and cons to how you do this. Now, with early blight, I've been reading papers of late where the spores actually can last a lot longer than late blight. And they've found normal composting methods do not actually destroy the pathogen because our compost piles at home do not get hot enough. Now, ours regularly goes through over 70 degrees at the start when we first start composting because we add so much green waste. But it doesn't mean that the outside of the compost bin on the edges gets to that same temperature too. So whereas we will compost some of our stuff, there's going to be a lot of it that we're actually probably won't. I haven't quite decided yet on what I'm going to do. As for the soil, there is talk of early blight actually can affect the actual soil. So if you do have soil that you've grown tomatoes in and there is maybe a chance of it being in the soil, then reusing that soil in areas where you're not going to grow anything in the nightshade family. So potatoes, your aubergines, your tomatoes, things like that. Keep it away from that kind of thing. So we're going to go through and start deciding which plants that we need to remove. We'll harvest what we can off these tomatoes, taking off any good tomatoes that don't seem to be infected with blight. You can eat the tomatoes that have been on a plant with blight, but they probably won't store for very long. Now, tomatoes in general don't do long-term storage as a whole anyway. So if you are going to use any tomatoes that have got blight, make sure that you use them and cook them. They could turn very brown and mushy and disgusting very, very quickly. But it's up to you whether you use them or not. We've always used any tomatoes that we've had blight on before over the years. It's not something that we've had massively, but it does happen. And it doesn't make you any less of a good gardener. It just means you've just been incredibly unlucky. Now, the pathogens are actually spread on the wind, so there's no avoiding it. So you can create as much airflow as what you want around your tomatoes. If blight's in the air and it lands on your plant and it's wet and humid conditions, it will grow. So today we're going to harvest what we've got, decide which plants we can leave in for a little bit longer, and try and ripen any that have not ripened so far. Now, we also have to check our potatoes, because what I've read is potatoes are the more known source of actually spreading blight to tomatoes. Something about farmers leaving old potatoes at the edges of their fields over winter with maybe blight and things like that, and then it kind of spreads around the country as a whole. And it's interesting that it spreads from the south going up north when it comes to blight. There's some areas that have blight a lot more than others, and probably out of 10 years of growing tomatoes, let's say, I think we've probably had blight 3 to 4 times. So in that scale of things, we've been quite lucky. Now, I would say it's a massive loss for us, but we're going to harvest the tomatoes of what we've got, and we were never going to get a massive harvest outdoors of any tomatoes. So in my eyes, instead of thinking negatively and woe is me, it will just give me more space to put something else in. But there is no saving these tomatoes now. Once one plant has got it, it will eventually spread to the rest of your tomato plants. And I'm really hoping that our polytunnel plants are actually a little bit safer. But there's no guarantee, because we have the window open all day and we have the door open all day, and all it takes is a couple of spores to actually land on those tomato plants. And with it being a little bit more humid in the polytunnel, it will really take hold very quickly. But you never know, we actually may be lucky and not lose our polytunnel. Now, these tomatoes, you can see that the blight's in the actual stem of the tomato. So the chances of this having blight on the inside is actually quite high. So because of the size, I'm not actually going to try and ripen this. There's just no point, because when you're ripening these tomatoes, that you're taking off a blight infected plant, if you have tomatoes that have actually got blight spores in them, the fruits themselves, they can actually spoil all the tomatoes that you're trying to ripen. So it's something that you have to do, is go through them every day to make sure that your tomatoes that you're ripening haven't started to rot with blight. Now, you can see with this one's actually got blight inside. So again, this one will be disposed of, because this will just ruin everything else. So these are the tomatoes that we've harvested today. Black crate is from the blight contaminated plants, which will be used, well, we're going to ripen them up inside the old conservatory with a few very ripe bananas and see if we can get some to ripen. But they must be checked on a daily to make sure none have actually started to rot. But we've also harvested all the rest of the outdoor tomatoes that are not in the same area where we've got blight. Blight happens so quickly that just leaving it for a couple of days may mean we lose the whole lot of tomatoes. And I'd rather try and ripen these up at home with some very ripe bananas in the box, somewhere nice and warm, than to lose the whole lot. Whatever doesn't ripen, we'll actually use for a fantastic green tomato chutney. So if you can salvage any, make sure that you're picking them. You can leave them for a little bit longer on the vine if they've only got a little bit of blight on the stem or the leaves. But bear in mind, blight can be extremely quick when it wants to be. And with the weather forecast here in the UK over the next 2 weeks still being very wet and humid, it's probably not worth that risk. So if you want any kind of crop from your tomatoes and you've got blight, make sure you're picking them, clearing the ground of any leftovers, and making the most of what you can from your harvest. So if you have blight, make sure that you're cleaning up, disinfecting anything that you've used on those tomato plants, like if you've used secateurs or anything else, make sure you give them a really good disinfectant clean. This removes any possibility of it spreading to anything else. And remember, any infected plant material needs to be disposed of correctly. You can put it into normal household compost bins for the council to actually take away, or you can burn it if that's what you can do on your plot. Commercial composting is actually extremely hot. That's why the soil is so dark when you buy commercial compost, because it's really heated. This will kill any spores. But on the normal side of us, you have to choose whether your compost bin is actually going to get hot enough to actually dispose of any pathogens on that plant. If it's just a compost heap that you're just adding to occasionally and it's not a hot compost heap, burn or dispose of any of those bits. If you end up with blight on your plot, just make sure you take these little precautions. It's not something that can be easily dealt with, but it doesn't mean that you can't grow for next year. This year's conditions have just been extremely wet and very humid, which really has not helped the growing conditions and the situation with blight. But give next year a go. Don't give up on it. But in some cases, if you're going to get blight, you are going to get blight no matter what you do. So don't give up if you've had blight this year. There's always next year. With the UK weather, you never know what the year's going to bring. So don't give up on your tomatoes. Keep going and keep harvesting what you can off your tomatoes. There is still plenty that you can use off of those trusses. But really, there's certain things as growers that are completely out of our control. And unfortunately, blight is one of them.